How is your imagination these days? Imagination can be a powerful thing and a dangerous thing and a scary thing. I know especially if you turn on your television or open your social media feed or your news feed. Imagination is a bit of a scary thing these days. But imagination can also be a really profoundly beautiful, powerful, and world-changing thing. And I've learned this lesson in many different ways in my life, but one way I learned it that I never expected to was by doing some work in a prison. And I never imagined in a million years that I would discover a model for building beloved community in a prison, but I did. And I'm here to tell you this morning that I believe strongly that ideal of beloved community that many Unitarian Universalists love to talk about, that powerful force of love, that understanding that can transform opponents into friends, is something that all of us are capable of bringing into the world through our imagination and through our interactions and the stories that we tell and create and bring to life when we come together. And it begins with doing this in community, imagining this world in community. And it can happen when we least expect it. So like I said, this realization came to me a few years ago when I was spending some time interning with an organization that supports youth who are incarcerated. And I still remember the first time that I approached that building, that prison. I remember the sense of utter hopelessness that I felt in myself as I walked up to that building. And I tell you, I swear that exact moment, the sun retreated from the sky to reveal a front of looming storm clouds. And inside in the lobby, everything was painted a drab shade of gray, and to me, it seemed like everything, even the lights were in cages. I attempted this very half smile at the man seated behind the desk in the middle of the room, and "have a seat" is all I got in response. And then, I think probably about 30 minutes, and exactly 276 ceiling tiles later, I am directed to a door at the far end of the room where I see this really tall, powerful figure of a man approach me. And I was really scared. But I see him approach me, and suddenly he has this smile that illuminated the entire room, and he shook my hand with a firm, friendly grip, and he said, "You must be Israel. I can't tell you how happy I am to see you here." And as he walked me back for my orientation there, he told me how much he appreciates the work that this organization was doing with the youth there. And he told me how much it meant to him and how much it meant to the youth. You see, when I was approaching this place, I had a very particular story in mind. My imagination was blocked, informed by reality, but it was blocked. For us, for so many of us today, in our world, it may seem like these stories, these experiences of hopelessness, of pain, of looming conflict, are our only possible stories, are the only possible outcome. Faced with so many of the personal and the structural challenges that we face, it can be very easy to become stuck and a sense of hopelessness. But from my experience learning from and building community with these youth led me to see that there is so often much more to the stark, hopeless scene than we see on the surface at first. It led me to see that there are people and ways of working together and reimagining and embodying new stories together. And witnessing and participating in this process showed me the power that these stories have to create change. So take, for instance, one story. There was a young man that I worked with, and he was a Somali refugee. His parents came from Somalia. And he grew up here in the United States in a community where he was constantly told that he and his family were terrorists. That's quite a story to hold. He grew up being told constantly that he was neither lovable nor a valuable member of a community. And when he was 16, he got arrested for getting into a fight with a shop owner who kept constantly harassing his family. And so there, in this place, we worked to try to build a community of loving support with people like this young man. And one way that we did it was we used theater games, believe it or not. So this thing called Theater of the Oppressed is a model that we used. And we started by using theater games to break down barriers, to get people comfortable with each other, to begin to foster relationships, trust, and even solidarity. And with time, and this process took a lot of time, these youth, these kids, some of them, began to share their stories with one another and with us, and began to recreate these stories and reenact them in new ways. And sometimes it usually started out by creating these stories in ways that related to the things that brought them there. Issues like racism, addiction, violence. But the act of sharing was so powerful because it made them realize that they are not alone, that they are not invisible, that they have a voice, and that they are a member of a community who cares about them. And the effects didn't end there. In fact, these stories got turned into plays, and the plays got taken out into the community. And they didn't just contain the stories that they brought them there. They were also filled with new and reimagined stories. These stories, for instance, helped that young Somali man, to see that the story that brought him to being there didn't have to be his only story. That he, who grew up in his situation, labeled a terrorist and a criminal, could be a friend, a neighbor, someone on the block who wants the same thing that so many of us want. A friendly smile when walking by neighbors on the street. A plot in a community garden, a place to set a plate of home-cooked sambusas at a block party in the neighborhood. And then when these new stories were taken out into the community, that is really where the power of new stories becomes most apparent. When we share these things, these new stories, these reimagined stories with ourselves, it allows us to see, to recognize ourselves in others. Our common shared story, to connect across boundaries, to build empathy, solidarity with one another. To witness in this way does not just invite you to be a passive spectator. It's a process of joining in, of witnessing, yes, but by witnessing, it changes our reality, the orienting story that we have for ourselves and as a community. And to witness this kind of a story is not just to be changed by them. It's to want to become the change by them. So, do you remember that smiling guard in the beginning of my story? Maybe are you still wondering why he was so happy to see me? So I found out later that man used to really not be quite so smiley. In fact, he was a pretty unpleasant person to be around. He was stoic, curt, sometimes rude, angry, and he was assigned to the unit where these youth were working together, where we worked together with the youth. And he had been posted as a silent witness to these storytelling activities for several months, actually. Several months of trust, building, and storytelling. At first, he was just there to do his job, keep them in line, yell. But later on, as he started to be a witness to these things for a while, he started to join in some of the silly theater games and exercises that we used to do. And later on, he was stationed, or he went out to accompany the youth when they went out into the public to perform one of their plays, because they actually got to do that, which is pretty amazing. And this particular play was about creating a new definition of masculinity. And in it, these youth shared stories, how they grew up in households often with absent fathers or violence and things like that. And they shared how when they were growing up, they thought that to be a man meant that you had to be this sort of cold, unemotional, or if you were emotional, it had to be anger and force, that you had to keep your things to yourself. But they also presented a new reimagined story of what it could mean to be a man. And this new definition was so much more nuanced and so much more different from our traditional gender roles that we have. These new definitions were more sensitive and nuanced and authentic to how they saw themselves, to how they saw their possibilities for being who they are in their bodies. And after the performance, several people in the audience were invited to dialogue with the performers after. And this guard sat in the very back and remained quiet for the whole time until the very end, when he raised his hand. And he spoke in a clear, loving voice and told them how incredibly proud he was of them. And he thanked them. He thanked them profusely for showing him how love and expression and authenticity are not limited by definitions of norms around gender. And by the end of this comment, this man, this guard, and all of these youth, and I'm pretty sure the whole audience were in tears, myself included. No doubt in my mind, there's no doubt in my mind that he was changed by those stories, as so many people that night might have been. In fact, he became one of the biggest supporters of the program after that. And not only that, he shared that he became a freer and better person because of it. And he went out into the world as a change maker himself, changed by that. So why was that guard so happy to see me? Because he understood the power behind building trust, behind building relationships, by sharing stories, and by reimagining together new stories in community. So Paulo Freire, who is the Brazilian activist who developed this style of storytelling that we use called Theater of the Oppressed, had this to say about liberation. Nobody liberates nobody. Human beings, people, liberate themselves in communion. When we share and when we listen to each other's stories, we realize that they are part of our collective story, and we have a responsibility to build on that story. Because just like that guard in my story, we realize that our liberation, our potential for joy is tied up, connected, tied up in the liberation of others. We realize that each of us have the responsibility to listen deeply, to speak from our hearts courageously, to always move towards love, to always move towards justice. We realize that it is through the sharing and the listening and the imagining of each other's stories that we begin to build this thing we call beloved community. But most of all, we realize that we must build it together. So let us go out and build it.